Welcome to the B'nai B'rith International webinar, Halle, the Bigger Picture. I will now pass over to Laura Cazés.
Welcome everyone for tuning in today. My name is Laura Cazés and I am the advisor on organizational development for the Central Welfare Board of Jews in Germany, in short ZWST. ZWST is the social umbrella organization of the Jewish communities in Germany. And in this function, but also for me as a person who grew up in the German Jewish community, last year's Yom Kippur was a very special one, a very different one. When I turned on my phone last year after stepping out of the synagogue on Yom Kippur, what was immediately clear is that this event would most certainly was on a very personal level, a very shocking one, yet not surprising, which is something that the following speakers will be referring to. But it was also, and it is certainly also something that Jews from all over the world can refer to. But it was, of course, also, it had a special meaning that this event took place in Germany. So what the question is that many of our viewers will probably have is also the question, how could this happen? Could this terror attack have been prevented, and why was there no security in the like in front of the community, for example, no police, which is a question that revolved a lot in international media. So for me as a representative of the Jewish communities of the ZWST and thereby the Jewish communities in Germany, it is important to point out that what is very special about the Jewish communities in Germany is that we have many, many small communities. There are around 105 Jewish communities scattered across the whole country, and many of these communities are consist of members that had immigrated from the former Soviet Union in the past 30 years. And these communities structurally are small, but also with regards to their visibility and also to their connectiveness, connectedness into the broader society. So this is something that we also deal with. Yes, when we speak with or speak about small Jewish communities that face different challenges. And this is also something that is very important to consider when talking about last year's event. That's for me from a personal level, but also from the perspective of our organization of the Central Welfare Board of Jews in Germany, very important to be able to engage on this topic and also give a perspective from different levels. I'm very happy to see or to have later on other speakers joining me that will give a deeper introduction into the topic and thereby, yes, give a broader understanding also of what we're talking about from a German Jewish perspective when speaking about the 9th of October in Halle. Yes, I would like to introduce you to today's B'nai B'rith event. B'nai B'rith International has, in a way, tried to bring these different perspectives together in this event called Halle, the Bigger Picture. Why the bigger picture? This is something that throughout the event there will be several perspectives on. And the event has the goal of exploring 4 of the important areas of learning what needs to be considered when talking about the attack in Halle. First of all, persistent anti-Semitism, as we saw most recently at another synagogue attack, yet now that has just taken place during Sukkot in Hamburg just a few days ago, which has also shaped the whole week of remembrance that we are right now having in Germany. The second point is also the more general term, the rise of far-right violent extremism throughout Europe, certainly also worldwide. but with a focus on Europe, but lastly also the question of how to build resilient communities, and thereby also communal resilience, and looking at the solidarity shown especially by youth in the aftermath of the attack by Jewish youth. To start this discussion with our first panelist, let me please first of all introduce to you Alina Bricman, who is the Director of EU Affairs for B'nai B'rith International. And with this, I would like to close my welcoming remarks and also thank you a lot for the invitation, Alina.
Thank you so much, Laura, for starting us off on this very important event. I thought it would be much more meaningful to hear as an opening from someone who is actually part of the local community, who has experienced in a much more first-hand way what the attack has meant. Of course, it has been incredibly impactful for the Jewish community in entire Europe as well as worldwide, but certainly people who have been on the ground in Germany, who have been to Halle and so on, have had an entirely different perspective on the event. So thank you so much for being with us today. As Laura mentioned, my name is Alina Bricman. I am the Director of EU Affairs at B'nai B'rith International. In organizing this webinar, we felt it would be important that our commemoration doesn't stop at remembrance, but also addresses this wider picture of what has the event meant for the Jewish community in Europe and what has been the aftermath of this terrorist attack. On that note, we have with us today a fantastic panel of experts from academia, from institutional settings, from civil society, as well as students working grassroots as activists on the ground level. My colleague Ilan Selby, who will co-moderate this event today together with me, will introduce our panelists, so I pass it on to him.
Thank you, Alina, and thank you, Laura, for your fantastic opening remarks. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone, depending on whereabouts you're joining us from. I have the pleasure today of introducing, as Alina said, a fantastic and varied panel of experts for us. So as I say, we're delighted to be joined by Günther Jikeli, the Erna B. Rosenfeld Professor at the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. Günther is also the co-founder and vice chair of IIBSA, Research and Education Institute on Antisemitism. Next, we're very pleased to have Ran van Diet Dortland joining us today, advisor to the EU Counter-Terrorism coordinator. We're also, as I say, delighted that Marina Chernivsky joins the panel today. Marina is the head of the Kompetenzzentrum for Prevention and Empowerment based in Germany. And finally, Noah Luft, Executive Director of the German Union of Jewish Students, completes the panel, and we're very much looking forward to her contribution to the discussion later on. I'll now pass back over to Alina, who will explain the structure to the event, and then we'll begin the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ilan, and welcome again to everyone. Just for viewers to know what to expect of this conversation format, we will be discussing with each of the panelists independently, focusing on their specific point of expertise for which we've invited them to join our discussion today. That being said, I welcome our first panelist, Professor Günther Jikeli, with whom we will discuss his perspective on persisting anti-Semitism today. So Günther, welcome. And let me perhaps begin by speaking to you from a personal perspective. In your daily work, you look at anti-Semitism from a very academic perspective. You look at historical trends, you analyze data, and you think of solutions of how to go about combating anti-Semitism. Yet I'm sure that when an event like Halle occurs, all that is put aside and you experience that from a deeply personal human lens. So I wonder simply, as a German, as a Jew, as someone who fights anti-Semitism daily in your work, how did you experience the anti-Semitic attack of 1 year ago?
Thank you first for having me. Yes, I remember this. This was a true shock, as for I think most of us here and on the call, that this could happen. This very violent attack against a Jewish synagogue, and then the killing of 2 people in the streets of Halle by a neo-Nazi who proved to be very full of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and had a very radical, not only rhetoric, but also this violence was completely shocking. So I was far away, but still, as you mentioned earlier, this has an impact all over the world, that this kind of violence against a Jewish community in Halle happened in the 21st century. So we have seen what I've seen in other places, unfortunately. Since the turn of the 21st century, we have seen an acceleration of anti-Semitism, both in the rhetoric and also in the violence. So when I heard about this, I immediately thought about Daniel Dayan. He's a French professor of media theory, and he described that already 5 years ago very well. These different steps of acceleration that we have been witnessing of anti-Semitism, and increasingly also murder. So that's a new step in this violence, what we've seen. So it it has come mostly from the fringes, but we see that, but there is also obviously a strong connection to the mainstream, and we should be aware of that. So what we see with this terrorist, that he is condemned widely, of course, but his ideas can also be found, some of them, in mainstream society. So that makes it so dangerous. And what we've also seen, that there's an acceleration, that these kind of events trigger other anti-Semitic events. So anti-Semites get emboldened by anti-Semitic action. So it's a very significant, very shocking event that we have to deal with, and we have to do everything that this will not be repeated.
Thank you, Günther. And I think you already touched on some of the important themes surrounding the anti-Semitic nature of the attack. You mentioned media theory, you mentioned the conspiracies and kind of the underlying ideology of the terrorists in Halle. So perhaps you could speak a little bit to this element of the ideology underpinning the violent attack. How do you conceptualize it, and perhaps how does anti-Semitism fit into what is at the end of the day a broader ideology?
Yeah, so I mean, if we look at this terrorist, first of all, he thought that this is not a soft target. So he thought this is a hard target. That's how he described it in what he published before the attack. So in this worldview, this is a Nazi ideology. He sees it himself as war, kind of, against the Jews. And if we look, for me, that was striking when a few days later, Spiegel TV, they did an interview with the mother of the terrorist. So the mother was asked, "What has your son against Jews?" And her response was like, "What? He has a wrong vocabulary. He has nothing against Jews in that sense. He has something against the people who are behind the financial power. Who has not?" So, of course, it's the mother of this terrorist, so it was apparently difficult for her to fathom what her son did. But this idea of these of Jews running the financial power is so widespread. In Germany, in the same month, in October 19, there was a survey that showed a quarter of the German population believed that Jews have too much power in international finance. So you see that there is this connection from the fringes to the mainstream. But what we I think what we often don't realize, in the minds of the anti-Semites, Jews are something abstract. For you and me, and for most people on the call, I guess, we daily interact with Jewish people. So these are real people for us. Jews are real people. For the anti-Semites, often they've never met any Jewish person. And the Jew, often, like even in singular, is something like a fantastic, abstract, something in their imagination. And so what is in the imagination, what he and other anti-Semites, I think, is something that is really evil, that is running the world. He talked about the word running by the Zog. So what's the Zog? The Zionist occupied government. And he was also against, he said he's against Muslims, he's against Antifa, so the left. And he thought that, but the control are the Jews. So this kind of thinking is unfortunately, in the radical form, it's good that it's not so much, but in the, if you want, milder forms, we have this kind of thinking that the Jews are just some imaginary figure, and anti-Semites just project anything onto them. So these kind of things we have seen, what we've seen also in conspiracy theories now, of course with coronavirus, but also what is very popular in the extreme right in Germany, but also in the United States and in other countries, this conspiracy theory about what they call great replacement. So the idea that the societies are changing, and they are changing quickly, but are changing in a way that white supremacists think that the white nation race is being replaced by immigrants, and they make Jews responsible. So they think that Jews orchestrate all this, and this goes back to the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So that's a very classic conspiracy theory, but this is now coming up again, and if we don't keep this in check, anti-Semites feel more and more emboldened to express these kind of things and even go into action.
I think it's exactly incredibly important that you touch on the fact that this is not something limited to the fringes, but quite common in the middle of society. And so for me, it's incredibly worrying, but also very interesting, almost as an academic question. How is it possible that in Germany, a country that has taken so many steps to address anti-Semitism, and I would even say a place where protecting the Jewish community is really part of the national self-definition today, where there have been investments in security, where there are federal and local level coordinators for combating anti-Semitism, something like this is possible. What do you think is perhaps fundamentally missing, or what fundamentally needs to be done to address this kind of middle of society, deeply rooted prejudices?
Right. Yeah, I think what's fundamentally missing is the understanding that Jews in Germany are really part of the German society, and that measures against anti-Semitism, that they also are for the good of the German society, is not what often from the beginning, since after the Second World War, when Germany needed to show some action that the society is changing, very often the motivation for some of the politicians was that they wanted to show that Germany is not as anti-Semitic anymore. So it was more like, in the interest of Germany, they would do something against anti-Semitism. But it has to be understood as really in the interest of German society that Jews are participating, they're full members of the German society, and that is something like normal, that Jews are integrated into German society. This is, in the understanding of most Germans, still difficult. Even the word Jude, the Jew in German, most people use it with a kind of reservation. They don't know how to deal with that. So it has to become something that Germans understand, well, this is part of their history, and there is also a very rich German Jewish history, and that Germans should know about. Similar to things that often come up, new forms of anti-Semitism or thinking about Israel that is similar to most Germans, something in their imagination. Most Germans have never been to Israel. It's something that they project things onto, and then they mix the Jews and Israel. It's all in one. But this is also like a normal country. There should be more like day-by-day interactions, I think. And this is really fundamentally missing. So in generally, everyone is against anti-Semitism, but when it comes to the like concrete things to condemn some specific things, then it's much more difficult, and that's not happening. So it's good that a lot of politicians, and many of them are really honest about it, they do want to change that, they do want to fight anti-Semitism, but often it's like in general terms and not looking into the details, not looking into the textbooks, for example. What do children learn about Jews? What do children learn about Israel? What is in the textbooks, in schools? What do teachers do? So there's a lot of things that need to be done in education, I think, and in like interactions.
Thank you, Günther. And I really appreciate this idea of changing the narrative from looking at how we can tackle anti-Semitism towards how can we really safeguard and even celebrate Jewish life as integral to national societies and European society as a whole. And I hope that later on, particularly with Maria and Noah, we will also be able to reflect on this further. I would like to address perhaps another point that I think was crucial with regards to the attack, and also a very current and relevant and increasingly urgent conversation today, which is that of the medium by which anti-Semitism more and more often spreads today, and which was also the medium of the right-wing terrorist in Halle, which is the online space. This was someone who radicalized online. He published a manifesto online, and he also filmed himself and distributed the attack itself. It was viewed by thousands of people before being taken down. Germany has recently hardened its legislation for tackling hate speech online. This measure hasn't necessarily been celebrated widely on an EU level, but I do think it's an important step forward. What is your take on anti-Semitism online? What do you see as relevant steps to be taken? But also, I would be interested to hear you speak about the initiatives that you are contributing to in this direction, and kind of the innovative solutions that you are looking at from an academic and civil society perspective.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, this ties into a lot of huge debates about social media, where this is going. Clearly, social media is the #1 distributor of anti-Semitic propaganda by far. So, but this is not surprising. Social media is increasingly important. We have debates on how to take down certain things, not only anti-Semitic things, but also other hateful content. Only in the last 1 or 2 years, arguably starting with Charlottesville in 2017, larger social media companies, they have cracked down on some of the most extreme disseminators. So Facebook and Twitter, they are taking these things down, and we see that in our research now. We're having difficulties in tracking these, because then what happens is there's a migration of these radical, either from the far right, the far left, or Islamists, to go to other platforms. So when they had a Facebook page that is now deleted, they are now maybe on Telegram or on Gap. I mean, Gap is even advertising, saying QAnon has been banned from the mainstream social media platforms. Please come to us. They're advertising this. And we will see increasingly this kind of drift, and it will be even more difficult probably to track some of them. We have also the problem that the main Twitter and Facebook and some others, those companies, they are American companies, and they have an interest in getting advertisement from major Western companies. Some other companies, maybe Russian-owned, they don't have this interest necessarily, and they don't want to necessarily crack down on this. They even have maybe an interest in spreading propaganda and spreading more controversy in European or American societies. So this will be just increasingly difficult to deal, and there must be a comprehensive way to look at that. But yes, we see that I think it's a good thing that at least the most radical things are now tracked down, and it's cracked down on these. What we saw, because this has this radicalization impact, that what we also clearly see with this attacker, this terrorist in Halle, that he was inspired by Christchurch, by the Christchurch attack against the mosque there. So we see that a lot of people who are not in organized groups offline see this kind of content and get radicalized by themselves mostly. And so it's important that it's more difficult for them to find this content. But they will find this content. If they want to find this content, they will just find it on other platforms. So you can still find these videos online if you really search for it, that he put up. So what can be done about it? I think we need to monitor what's happening. So that's what we're trying. We try to, we organized a hackathon and a little datathon to just identify this kind of content. But I think it's also important not to only to look at the most radical forms, but also as the milder forms, and to do something against it. And there we need like counter narratives, and there we need to make sure that there is a conversation. That's another difficulty that we have on social media. There's often not a conversation. So because that you find your own group there. So we need to penetrate that. And there needs to be some kind of reform in the long run that gives some more structure, I think, to the social media publication. But it's really a difficult task, which will be in the debates in the next decade, I guess, what to do with all that. Mm-hmm.
But you're really doing a tremendous job on this topic. So you were being much too modest in your presentation, and I think you're absolutely right. I think it's urgent that Jewish organizations also increase their literacy on this topic so that they can be effective in proposing solutions, pushing for legislation, for voluntary measures, and the like. And that's something that we've been ourselves trying to be increasingly active on at Reedt. Günther, thank you so much for sharing your very important insights, but also for the work that you're doing every day on the topic of anti-Semitism. I hope you can stick around for the rest of the discussion as part of the audience, and it was really a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you a lot for sharing your perspectives today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Next, we will be hearing from Ran van Reedt Dortland. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Ran is an advisor to the EU Counter-Terrorism coordinator. He specializes particularly on far-right extremism, so there could not be a better fit for the conversation today, as this is the second perspective that we want to address, the rising violent far-right extremism across Europe. So thank you so much for being with us today. Unfortunately, we've seen even within the past week that far-right terrorism continues to be a major threat to European society. Laura mentioned in her introduction the recent violent incident at the synagogue in Hamburg. I would propose, however, to start by understanding your general portfolio a little bit better. So perhaps you could tell us what the Office of the Coordinator for Countering Terrorism of the EU does and how far-right terrorism fits within this.
Okay, thank you very much, Alina, for your introduction, and thank you to Benai Brit for having me. What does the EU counterterrorism do? Well, let me first say that sometimes when I meet colleagues or journalists or members of the public, they think that the EU counterterrorism coordinator has a staff of hundreds of people and a huge budget. Unfortunately, that's not the case. He has a staff of 6 advisors, 5 of whom are seconded by EU member states, by national administrations to the coordinator. I'm one of those. I am seconded by the Dutch government to the EU temporarily to work with the EU counterterrorism coordinator. His function was created in 2007, 14 years ago in the meantime, 13 years ago. By the EU Council, and my boss, Gilles de Kerkhove, has been the second EU counterterrorism coordinator. What does he do? I would say that there are 2 sort of major functions of the EU counterterrorism coordinator. The first one is to ensure coherence between EU policies in the area of counterterrorism. Of course, there are many policy strands as part of the EU's general counterterrorism strategy. Policy strands that have to do with financing of terrorism, with development assistance to third countries, with diplomatic cooperation with third countries, all sorts of legislation introduced by the Commission, for instance, on the use of drones or the use of explosives, etc. So it is tremendously important that there is coherence within these policies. And it's also tremendously important that there is coherence between these policies and between the counterterrorism policies of the member states. So that's the first sort of major strand of work of the EU counterterrorism coordinator. The second major strand of work is for him to identify lacunas in counterterrorism at the moment, gaps, also very much to identify new developments and to propose solutions, to propose new joint actions, perhaps new legislation, and I think that's even more important than the first strand. So how does right-wing extremism, violent extremism and terrorism fit into this? Well, it's definitely an example of a new area that he has identified about 1.5 years ago as a priority area. Of course, right-wing extremism is old, it has existed, has been a problem in Europe for decades, but clearly, as the previous speaker also said, it's on the rise now. And about 1.5 years ago, we were all shocked about the terrorist attacks on 2 mosques in New Zealand by an Australian right-wing extremist, which was a wake-up call to an extent. But there had been many similar attacks on mosques and synagogues and other targets in the United States, for instance, by right-wing violent extremists. And there were definitely already 2 years ago signs that this would come to Europe. So before Halle, even the counterterrorism coordinator, put this on the agenda of the EU. And exactly at the time of the attack, in the same week as the attack in Halle, exactly a year ago, the Justice and Home Affairs Council of the European Union adopted a couple of actions to take at EU level against violent right-wing extremism and terrorism. But I suppose I can talk about that later on.
Thank you very much, Ran, for the introduction. And I do think it's very helpful to understand a bit of the, let's say, legislative framework and the framework among member states within which you operate. So thank you very much for that. I do remember, based on your last comment about DG Home Affairs, that I was in a meeting on community security right in the week when Halle happened. It was a meeting that addressed security for all religious minorities. And just a few days later, we learned that it was only a wooden door that protected the worshippers in Halle. So certainly a very timely topic. And I would have said as a lay person, indeed, that looking at far-right terrorism may have been one of these identifiable gaps. I wonder if within this period, since you've been addressing far-right terrorism more explicitly within your work, you've been able to see certain trends, any particular direction that this conversation is shaping towards?
Yes, absolutely. And I think a couple of these trends have already been mentioned by Günther just now. But definitely, well, first let me first of all say that jihadist terrorism or Islamist extremist terrorism is still the main threat, main terrorist threat to Europe. That threat has not disappeared, even though we see fewer terrorist attacks perpetrated by Islamist extremists in Europe in the last 2-3 years than in the 4 years before. But it's still very much there. And the fact that we have seen fewer Islamist extremist terrorist attacks in Europe is due to the fact that police and law enforcement services have simply become much better at detecting and breaking up terrorist cells and in catching lone terrorist actors than they have been before. And homegrown radicalization among Islamist extremists in Europe remains the greatest problem here. So they don't come from the Middle East or from abroad. They're actually radicalizing here in our societies, and that's a major problem. That said, the right-wing violent extremism and terrorism is clearly on the rise throughout the West, including in the European Union. And in some parts of the European Union, for instance in Germany, this form of violent extremism now poses just as much of a threat as jihadist terrorism. And of course, in 2019, Europe faced several terrorist attacks motivated by right-wing violent extremism. My job is to talk about terrorism, but I'm very keenly aware that there are all sorts of, let's say, lower level violence, which still have a tremendous impact on victims that do not classify as terrorism. And I'm also very happy to talk about those forms of violence. Now, when we talk about attacks, right-wing extremist attacks, none of those were organized and carried out by structured groups. That's very important to remember as well. All of them were perpetrated by lone actors. That is not to say that they have not been inspired by propaganda disseminated by certain groups, but they were not managed by certain groups, or they were not dispatched by certain groups to perpetrate these attacks. They did so at their own initiative. And I think that right-wing violent extremist groups very often realize that lone actor terrorism is much more beneficial to them than any other form of violence that they organize themselves. They know exactly how far they can go in their statements and in their activity to remain just within the limits of what is legal. And in the meantime, they leave it to their so-called fanboys on the internet, for instance, to take action by themselves without any risk to the organization. Now, another characteristic that I would say of recent forms of right-wing violent extremism is that, in the past, often, not always, of course, but often right-wing violent extremists were easily recognizable. They were neo-Nazis, they were skinheads, they were football hooligans, they were members of motorcycle gangs, etc. Now, the internet nowadays provides a lot of anonymity. And this has resulted, let's say, in an expansion of the audience base for right-wing violent extremism. What we see now, for instance, also is the identitarian movement in Europe, which is a movement that claims to defend European culture from an invasion perpetrated by or coming from minorities, from outsiders. And those are ostensibly very respectable people that don't look like skinheads, etc. Another trend that I would like to mention is, and that's very important, increased international connectivity between right-wing extremists. And once again, the internet plays a crucial role here. It was already mentioned by the previous speaker, individual right-wing violent extremists, terrorists often imitate each other, reference previous attackers when carrying out a violent act. The Halle attacker was an example, but many others as well. The attacker in Christchurch, New Zealand, for instance, referenced Anders Breivik in Norway in 2011. What we see is that a formerly disparate group of marginal extremists is increasingly turning into a well-connected movement with, and that's very important, a coherent ideology structured around this slogan of the Great Replacement, already mentioned just as well. The Great Replacement comes from, that notion comes from a book by a French author, Renaud Camus, who says that white Europeans are in danger of being replaced by minorities coming from outside or even inside. And that notion plays a unifying role now ideologically across the West for right-wing violent extremists. You may also remember that the protesters in Charlottesville, Virginia, in the US in 2017 shouted, "Jews will not replace us." And the identitarian movement has also been constructed around that notion of a great replacement. So that's very important. I mean, in the past, right-wing violent extremists in the United States were very different from right-wing violent extremists in Europe. Very often, those in the United States were libertarians who wanted the government to leave them alone, whereas those in Europe wanted an authoritarian state. But that notion of the great replacement plays an important unifying role. Maybe also worth mentioning is that just like jihadists or Islamist extremists, right-wing extremists now travel abroad to fight in an armed conflict. Jihadists travel to Syria and they join ISIS or Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, but right-wing violent extremists from across the West travel to Ukraine. And paradoxically, there they have joined both sides of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. So some of them have joined the side of the Russian separatists, and others have joined the side of right-wing violent extremist Ukrainian groups. Sometimes they fight each other across the front lines, but it's still, of course, extremely worrying because just like jihadists do in Syria, they gain combat expertise, they gain expertise in handling weapons and perhaps even manufacturing explosives that they could potentially use in their home countries later on to perpetrate attacks. And this is really a challenge for us in Europe because whereas we can investigate, monitor, investigate, prosecute European citizens who've joined terrorist organizations in Syria, that is much more difficult for European citizens who've joined militias in Ukraine because these militias are not considered as terrorist organizations. So we cannot call them foreign terrorist fighters, as we call those jihadists who went to Syria. We just call them foreign fighters. Then something on Corona, on the current pandemic. The pandemic has not led to a greater number of terrorist attacks. I've read this here and there. Our figures don't show that the pandemic itself has led to a greater number of terrorist attacks at this stage, or even violence. But what is clear is that the pandemic has given rise to an explosion of hate speech on the internet. Much of this is directed against Jews. All sorts of conspiracy theories that claim that Jews have invented the virus, that Jews have invented the virus in order to later invent a vaccine and then claim credit for saving mankind. That sort of nonsense is unfortunately very much on the rise during the pandemic. All sorts of hate speech. And if the past is anything to go by, I mean, hate speech could ultimately result in violent attacks by inspired lone actors, for instance. So this is really worrying. And you know, and in connection with this, I mean, what we're seeing is a convergence between conspiracy theories and disinformation on the one hand, and terrorist speech and hate speech on the other. So my boss, Gilles de Kerkhoven, the EU counterterrorism coordinators, really hope that we can combine our work at the EU against disinformation on the one hand and hate speech on the other, and that we can also combine our dialogues on these subjects with, for instance, major internet companies.
Thank you, Ron. That was an incredibly comprehensive and very illuminating presentation. I resist the urge to ask you, from my curiosity, how come Ukraine? I will rather say that this point about, you know, integrating more and more policy areas together is incredibly important. That's a big push also in the sphere of policy to tackle anti-Semitism. We're thinking, how can this be addressed across policy areas? So learning that you are working together with folks dealing with disinformation is very encouraging. And so perhaps this is a good segue to try to speak a little bit more about the actual responses to all these various threats that you outlined. And perhaps in particular, it would be very interesting to hear how you are dealing with this question of convening online and the idea of lone wolf, lone actors that are clearly not at the end of the day lone actors, because they are radicalized in these clear circles, even if they are not formal.
Yeah. Well, maybe first of all, because I am the only speaker here, I think, on behalf of the European Union. I am not a specialist on anti-Semitism. I am a specialist on counter-terrorism, which is something different. But perhaps I should also say that the EU, of course, is undertaking a lot of work against anti-Semitism. So very briefly, before moving on to right-wing extremist terrorism, anti-Semitism is a major priority for the current German EU presidency. The EU is working on a common security approach to better physically protect Jewish communities and institutions in Europe. And the German EU presidency has now also launched an initiative to mainstream the fight against anti-Semitism as a cross-cutting issue in all policy areas. And the EU Council will soon adopt a declaration on this that will be widely published and then also implemented by dedicated working groups. And my boss, the EU Counterterrorism Coordinator, is working with the Commission Coordinator and with you for combating anti-Semitism, Katharina von Schnurbein, and with Jewish communities. And he firmly believes that it is really important to combat anti-Semitism as a form of prevention of terrorism. So that's important to mention here. Then on what is the EU doing on right-wing extremism and terrorism in general? First of all, of course, the EU's existing strategy is colorblind. It addresses all forms of terrorism, irrespective of ideology. But as I just mentioned in answer to your previous question, the Justice and Home Affairs Council of the EU has adopted 4 strands of joint work, particularly on violent right-wing extremism and terrorism. The first one is to create a better overview of the extent of the problem in Europe. What we now think is that the problem might be underestimated, because we do not have a uniform method of classification of attacks in Europe. And I'm talking now not just about terrorism, but about all sorts of violence motivated by right-wing violent extremism, motivated by xenophobia, anti-Semitism, other forms of bigotry. Many of these attacks might be classified as hate crimes. Others might be classified even as terrorism. Some might just be prosecuted and registered as ordinary crimes and might never actually be registered by member states. And of course, there's also the problem that some violent acts might not even be registered at all because the victims do not go to the police. So we need to develop a better overview. We also need to make sure that we have a good overview on what member states are actually doing to address right-wing violent extremism in their own country, what legislation they have in place, for instance. So that's a first strand of work. Second strand of work is to develop and share good practices on how to strengthen the prevention, detection of all forms of violent extremism and terrorism, notably, of course, right-wing violent extremism and terrorism. An example with this would be, for instance, exit and disengagement programs. Many member states have programs in place to help those that want to leave Islamist extremist groups, and they have valuable experience on this. Now, a small number of member states also have programs for right-wing violent extremists. Germany, for instance, and some Nordics, Sweden. Their experiences could usefully be shared with other member states so that they would also have those programs in their countries in an effective way. Another example of sharing experiences, sharing expertise is the work of Europol, the European police organization in The Hague, and Eurojust, the European organizations in which public prosecutors of the member states work together, which is also based in The Hague. They provide expertise and facilitate actual exchange of information between police services and prosecutors, public prosecutors in member states, on specific cases of violence perpetrated by right-wing violent extremists. That's very important. It's important that that work is expanded. Now, the third area, and that comes to, I think you're particularly interested in, that is work on the internet. That is a particularly difficult subject. I think, as Günther already very eloquently explained, it touches upon the key value of freedom of expression, of course, but it's also more difficult to address this issue than you think. Because, for instance, if major internet platforms ban right-wing extremists from expressing their views, they go to other platforms. Still, we think it is important that they do so, simply because if Facebook bans all sorts of hate speech, and if those that post hate on Facebook have to go to other platforms, it's simply much more difficult for them to reach a wide audience. So it does affect them in the end when a major platform like Facebook bans that sort of hate speech. We discuss with major digital companies in the United States, mostly based in the United States, not all of them, in the EU Internet Forum. What we discussed, for instance, with them is how they keep their terms and conditions up to date with regard to hate speech, but also how they enforce their terms and conditions in practice. And that's not always easy for those companies either, because right-wing violent extremists know exactly how to express themselves in a way in which it's difficult to actually stop them from doing so. They use sarcasm, in-group memes, all sorts of symbols, etc. We try to help those digital companies also by giving them overviews of right-wing extremist symbols we think are unacceptable. The EU has an internet referral unit which flags all sorts of illegal content to these companies so that they can block that content. The EU Internet Referral Unit, which is based at Europol in The Hague, has very successfully worked on Islamist extremist content over the past few years, but it will very soon start working on right-wing violent extremist content as well. Yet we think that dialogue with internet companies is not enough. We will soon adopt, hopefully, a regulation on terrorist content online in the EU, which obliges internet providers who are active in the EU to remove any terrorist content I'm talking about, narrowly defined, immediately, so within an hour. What we believe at the EU Counterterrorism Coordinator is that we should also start addressing algorithmic amplification at the EU soon. Algorithmic amplification is the process whereby tech companies use algorithms to generate recommendations to users, which are aimed at maximizing user time, because of course that would bring in most revenues for those companies. Now in practice, we have the impression that this leads to amplification of sensationalist content, because people would simply look at that for a longer time, extremist content, at the expense of mainstream or moderate views. So in that sense, there is no level playing field anymore in the public debate because of the use of all sorts of completely untransparent algorithms used by Facebook, YouTube, etc. We think that there should at least be more transparency as regards to the algorithms that are used and what they are used for and how they are used. And then finally, the last area that I would like to mention is cross-border cooperation. It goes without saying, perhaps. I mean, the United States is a crucial partner. The US government also very much recognizes the threat coming from what they call racially and ethnically motivated extremism and terrorism. We see that violent right-wing extremists in the United States and in Europe are in touch, exchange propaganda, influence each other, travel to each other's countries. So it's crucial to work with the US for us, and the US also wants to work with us on this subject. Another important international partner are the countries, the 6 countries in the Western Balkans, which are not EU member states, but of course crucial partners to us. We are providing all sorts of counter-terrorism assistance to these countries, and this is not just aimed at Islamist extremism, but now also very much aimed at fighting right-wing violent extremism.
Thank you very much, Ron, for that overview. And it was, as you said, the part about online extremism is indeed particularly relevant. In fact, this point about algorithmic amplification is explicitly mentioned in a recent policy document that Jewish organizations put forward together in light of the Digital Services Act. So we hope that this, along with other recommendations, will be reflected there. Thank you for detailing a bit the EU response to terrorism generally and right-wing terrorism specifically. But oftentimes I think Jewish communities and Jewish Europeans generally, in their often sense of insecurity, would find more solace in knowing more explicitly from folks representing the EU institutions whether they can feel indeed safe in Europe, a place where they and we feel is really our home. So perhaps I would like to end our discussion with you with this simple question of, can Jews feel safe in Europe?
Yeah, you know, I as a civil servant, as a government representative, I don't feel that I should be telling people how they should feel. Feelings are by
your personal perspective.
Yeah, well, you know, feelings are by definition subjective. What I do know is that many Jews in Europe feel unsafe at the moment. We have taken good note of the very important data that we saw in a survey carried out by the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency and published in December 2018 on perceptions of anti-Semitism and of anti-Semitic violence in Europe. And there it becomes very, very clear that many Jews feel unsafe. I'm not going to tell people, you know, this is right or this is wrong. It is just an important fact, an important given for us. And it means that there is an imperative for us to work to protect Jewish communities better, Jewish citizens, Jewish institutions in Europe. So what I'd like to say is that, you know, we share the concern of Jews who feel unsafe. We recognize that there is a problem and that there is a growing problem. with regard to anti-Semitic violence, and we are determined to do something about it. And that's also why, it's so good that we are talking now. And that's why I'm grateful for being invited here. I mean, it's important for me to be able to explain what the EU is already doing, but it's perhaps even more important for us at the EU to listen and to have this sort of dialogue.
Well, we are certainly incredibly grateful to have had the opportunity to hear from you about what the EU is doing, but also to use this as an open door for the future to make sure that there is an open communication, as there has been in the past. We've had the pleasure of having your boss, Mr. De Kerkhove, at meetings on anti-Semitism, and it's always been very informative to have these exchanges. So thank you so much for being with us today, for all the work that you are doing every day in your capacity. And I hope you can stick around for the rest of the conversation.
I will.
Wonderful. And let me pass the floor on to my colleague Ilan, who will continue with the last two perspectives that we are presenting today.
Thanks, Alina, and thank you to the two speakers, to Ran and to Günther, for their contributions beforehand. And so in going straight on to the next part of the discussion on the overarching topic of resilience and empowerment, as I said, we're very pleased to have Marina Chernivsky with us, the head of the Kompetenzzentrum for Prevention and Empowerment. Welcome, Marina. If I can begin by asking, you've been able to see firsthand the impact that the Halle attack has had on the community in Halle and across Germany more broadly. You've travelled to Magdeburg for the trial on multiple occasions, a trial where 43 of the survivors of the attack bravely put themselves forward as co-plaintiffs and face the attacker in court. Seeing their testimonies as being incredibly empowering for many in Jewish communities across Europe. So in light of that, I would ask, what struck you most in the aftermath of the attack, as well as its effect on the community? What are the things that most stood out to you, really?
Last part, I don't understand acoustic. What I think about? Sorry.
What are the elements that most stood out to you in the aftermath and the effect that this had on the local community, both in Halle and in Germany more broadly?
Yes. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very glad to be there and yes, to be a part of the discussion. We have right now this week and next week also many other actions around Halle, 1 year after Halle, and yes, I have many thoughts about the impact of this attack, and I think it's important to understand for me also that Halle and Hanau also and other attacks are a logical consequence of anti-Semitic and racist continuity in this country, and not only in this country. And I think in general the inability to understand that anti-Semitism is there and how it shapes our thinking and behavioral still effective today, and on the other hand also to think about Jewish population, to think about minorities, how they deal with this dangerous situation, with this threat, because it's not only Halle, it's not only Hanau, it's not only Hamburg, it's about the climate, the social and political climate, and therefore, it's very important for me not only to think about the attack, but also about the reprocessing the attack, yes? And the trial is one part of this reprocessing. And like not only the reaction on Halle, but also for me, yes, the try to understand how it can be happened. And my hope was that the society will be very, attentive to this trial, but I don't see this effect. So, but on the other hand, I think, yes, as OFAC, as a part of OFAC, sorry, my English is not very very strong. As a part of OFAC, counseling center for those affected. We have been accompanying the Halle process for months in a cooperation with other partners in Halle. And I think we are experiencing a historical process, Jewish people, young Jewish people who testify in Magdeburg and make strong Jewish voices heard. Yes, and it's completely new. And I think that there has never been anything like this before. Yes. Jewish people who speak about their experiences, about their family connection to the trauma of the Shoah, their demands and claiming on politics, the present, before attack, life before and life after. And it has never been so clear and so audible, in my opinion. And these people make the terrible effects of such an attack perceptible for the other. And they are in the same space with the perpetrator, yes, and also in the same space with so many people who doesn't experience with Jewishness, yes, Jewishness, like a life in completely separated room spaces, Jewish life in Germany and non-Jewish life in Germany, and there is no connection. So I think it's very unique, and I hoped we will learn and we will have much more attention, but it's not, in my opinion, and I think we run the risk of missing this opportunity to learn from it. And yes, the insight of the authorities, including anti-Semitism, for example, in the ranks of police, yes, is also a big problem right now, not only right now, always. And I know it because we have much experience in the work with police and also education system. And yes, it's a big issue to deal with it from these different perspectives, from Jewish perspective, but non-Jewish perspective, and perspective of authorities and institutions.
Thank you very much, Marina. And no, it is very interesting to hear your take. Obviously, you're on the ground, and your perceptions of what's going on are very valued, and I really appreciate you sharing that with us. Perhaps you mentioned briefly there the sort of police response, and that's something I want to talk about from a perhaps more of a policy perspective, as is often the case, and rightly so, I must add. Much of the policy conversation following the attack focused on the security apparatus. But I do wonder where you see the role of empowerment and resilience building for the community, and whether you think this has an impact on society as a whole. Where do you see the relationship between greater empowerment and security coming into play?
So for me, it's important to understand empowerment as a political process. It's not only about to strengthen and empower myself, but also empowering the group, empowering the community to have a strong voice, awareness of the biases and voids and empty spaces, and to do everything to connect non-Jewish society to the Jewish society, and also to strengthen the non-Jewish society and professionals in the first line for me and my work, to become more sensitive, to become more to be competent in the dealing with, because anti-Semitism is not a sporadic incidence, it's a continuity of anti-Semitic ressentiments, and anti-Semitism is a part of the institutional structure and a part of society. So, but the empowerment of Jewish people and Jewish communities right now, in the time of increased solidarity and visibility, stronger visibility of Jewishness, I see the synergy to go in the direction to have to, to gain the power of definition and to be a part of solution. Yes. And maybe it's not necessary to talk about anti-Semitism in the first line. We can talk about what it means when Jewish history is told and alienated by non-Jewish people, by non-Jewish institutions, by non-Jewish politics. We can talk about when Jewish children witness this alienation in the school. They are in the space, in the room, but it's not about them. We can talk about what it means where the right to belong to the society, to the German society, is violated and expropriated in generally. We can talk about the right to be in Germany as a Jewish part of this society, because it's a big problem. We could talk about what it means to make the needs, clear and once again, but nobody listen. Yes, we can talk about these questions, and maybe it's important in the term of empowerment to find one own rule in this process and this discussion and developing our own voice. And it can be very empowering for young Jews today. And I think we don't have any other option. So, and for the majority society, non-Jewish society, it's an opportunity to find access to this topic, like very idealistic picture, yes. And I think the Jewish community in Germany is very resilient, in my opinion. But in the same time, the community is struggling for the right to belong, to be safe, to be heard, and to have a right to tell and to tell our own story. Not to because it's a big struggling to have this right to be. I have some insights. One rabbi from Rebecca Mladi, the head of Resilience Weeks, said after Yom Kippur service, just a moment, she had survived, yes, the attack in Halle, and she brought, after holding her own Yom Kippur service, we did too much, and what a fantastic feeling this is. We had 2 security guards, 4 public safety officers, 1 police car, 4 social workers, and 1 psychologist on call, in cooperation with Avir, to protect our right to be, both our physical being and our mental and emotional health. And I think many Jewish people feel that they have to do a lot to be allowed to be, yes, and they must defend it again and again. So, yes, we are living in a law state, and the state give us the right to be safe, but it's not obviously there. And I think we must see also the minority protection, not so narrowly. We must talk about rights to security and integrity. But if we are talking about the security, we don't talk only about guarded synagogues, but also about the right to be and to be a part of, and to have the right to defend ourselves, but also to be heard, and yes, not to struggle with I'm Jewish and German, and may I be, should I be? So,
and it's a crucial point you make. The nature, the need to be, and to be, perhaps what that might mean for different people, whether it's the need to be proud and to speak up in certain ways. And it's exactly this element that I wanted to delve into a bit further. An important part of your work and that of the Competence Centre is victim support and creating a space, as you say, an open and safe space for discussion. At the same time, from a linguistic or a terminological perspective, and as you've alluded to, in the aftermath of the Halle attack, we focused on speaking about survivors rather than victims, shifting the narrative away from one of victimhood towards one of resilience and empowerment. How do you see this shift, and what do you think it brings to the community and to your work?
Just a little correction, a little one. The Kompetenzzentrum is an institute running by ZWST, an institute for education and also empowerment and also research. OFEC, as a consulting center service, is a center for victims, for people who had an anti-Semitic attack or was part, yes, for those affected, not victims, those affected. So it's important to figure out the difference. So, and I'm head of Kompetenzzentrum and also by OFEC. As a competence center, it was very important for us to create spaces for affected people direct affected people, but also for the community itself. Different projects and lectures and seminars were held, but OFEC was from the beginning the center agency for those affected, for directly affected people. So for the both organizations, and for me very personally, it's very important for many years to figure out how can we shift the paradigm and to change and to form the debate and the discourse in the society, in the media, also in the research, also in the education, towards inclusion of Jewish voices, experiences, and subjects. Not to deal permanently with something like imaginative Jew, yes, historical object, because in the middle of anti-Semitism rhetoric, we find always the problem of objectification, to see the Jewish people not like people, like, oh, it's important to know about Jewish history. No, it's important to know about Holocaust. But yes, but to know, to get to know about Holocaust, it also to be in a contact, in relationship with this topic. It's not only about gain the knowledge, it's also about to be in a contact and in relationship. And in Germany, it's very specific because the topic, the whole topic round about Jewishness, Jewish life, Jewish culture, and anti-Semitism in the end, yes, it's very intensive topic, toxic. So I don't know if it's understandable in my very bad English, but so we must deal with it and to work on this shifting. It's everyday work. It's everyday work, because it's not possible. I think it's about it's about the non-Jewish society and the perspective of non-Jewish society on Jewish society, Jewish life, Jewish people. And it's like about one man with kippah, yes, from this side. This is the most usable picture in the media, for example, without anything. So to be a Jew in Germany, and today it's okay to be maybe a little bit safe, and it's okay to live in Germany, and Berlin is very nice city and very open, but it's not open for everyone in the same measure. For minorities, visible attribute, for Jewish people, it's not open. It's not open enough. It's not. Yes, it's also discrimination on everyday basis, and therefore it's so important. I think that Jewish actors to be professionals and to be part of these discussions, and not only like right now, but also in the middle of the place where the solution and discussions and debates are held. And I think Halle was, in many terms, like very important factor, and I don't know in English, effect, and has many effects and impact on many people in the Jewish community. And I hope, idealistic view, also in a majority society, but it's a very long process.
Absolutely. And please, you shouldn't apologize for your English. It is very, very good. And I really thank you for your contributions. I think it's interesting that you're speaking to the need to have a relatable education. You know, at times Jews are seen as this abstract being which lends itself to conspiratorial thought, and we've seen that spoken throughout all the speakers from Günther to Ran to yourself on it. So it's interesting to note that element of continuity throughout this discussion. So thank you very much, Marina, for your contributions to this. And I'll now move on to the next part of the discussion. Let me add Noah. And yeah, so in moving on to the final part of the event, I hope to take a look into, with Noah, solidarity and the Jewish identity. And so welcome Noah Luft, the Executive Director of the Jewish Student Union of Germany, JSUD. Thank you for joining us, Noah. I'd like to begin by asking what the impact was of the Halle attack on the German Jewish Student Union. Specifically, what were the dominant feelings of your members? Were there changes to security levels and protection that you noticed? And in terms of your union's programming and activities, were there any real shifts there that you can tell us?
Yes, also, first of all, thank you for having me and to represent the Jewish Student Union of Germany, JSUD, on that panel today. So about like the impact on the attack on like JSUD or the members, it was for sure like a shock for everyone, but on the other hand, it wasn't really a surprise. And of course, like how we work, and especially when we have like public events, the security measures changed since then, and we also see it as an even more relevant topic than it was like before. Of course, it was always important and always to consider, but after like such an attack happened, it is now even more important, and we did change our way in like how to have security and on like events. And one specific thing we did, for example, was a few weeks after the attack, we had for the board and for myself, we had a professional workshop about like risk and crisis management. And this is like also very important for us, so we could like reflect on the situation also in a more professional way, and also for the future, how to keep measures up and how to keep like active people of JSUD on events, on workshops, and ourselves safe.
Thank you for that. It's unfortunately, it seems to have been somewhat of a tragic watershed in a way. but I guess there certainly is the necessity for it, and it is good to see that there were certain strengthenings of protection. Now, I want to talk specifically on a campaign that JSUD did that I saw yesterday at a commemoration event that you were at in Halle. It was a hugely successful campaign done in solidarity with Ismet Tekin, the local Halle kebab shop owner. Would you be able to talk us through this initiative in more detail? How did it come about, and what effects has the campaign had? And perhaps as well, how do you perceive the campaign was received locally?
Yeah, sure. So actually it started with a survivor of the Halle attack, Christina Freis, who attended the service on Yom Kippur a year ago. And she is still in close contact with Tekin and his brother. And she kind of realized their financial issues they have at the moment due to the state aid, like the financial help you receive after such an attack, that weren't like that they haven't been considered in, and like in that case didn't really receive. And also due to the pandemic and just like that the numbers of customers dropped. So and that was why Christina reached out to me in the first place and asked me if I can pass the idea of doing something for the Tekin brothers to JSUD. And yeah, and then we realized that it was very important to draw not only attention to the Tekin brothers' fight to save their livelihood, but also like we wanted to create something that they can directly profit from. So like after I passed it on to the board, Ruben, who is a member of the board, and I came up with the idea of a fundraising so that we can reach the attention to the brothers also, but also like do something and like raise money for them so they can like have something in their hands in a way. So and he also asked about the effect the campaign had. So the thing was that it took us with some surprise actually that it got that huge. So the effect it had on especially the local society was immense, but it wasn't only locally actually, because we had donors from all over the world, because the media covered the campaign internationally. Like we started with like local newspapers here in Germany, but also there was an article about the campaign in the New York Times. So we had a lot of American donors, for example, also. And yeah, I don't know, also like the Turkish media or the British media covered it, the Israeli media as well. So it reached a lot of different people. And yeah, but actually, I think that the reason why this campaign was so successful in the end was because it happened in the name of solidarity. And it was like, because we like, and I think a lot of people realize that, especially during this time when like far-right extremism and anti-Semitism, like how the other panelist said, is rising here in Europe. And I think that was when people realized it is more important to stay together and to fight against this hate together, and like to be solidary with each other and to be resilient still in a way. And I think that's why people supported that idea of the campaign that much.
Thank you for sharing, and huge congratulations for the work in the campaign. I think you're being quite modest as well. You managed to raise, is it around just under 30,000 euros, or
how much we raised? We raised almost about 30,000 euros.
Exactly.
Yes.
No, huge congratulations. It's such a commendable achievement. And I want to, perhaps we can come back to the topic of solidarity towards the end, but I want to speak specifically on the issue of anti-Semitism right now, and in terms of combating anti-Semitism. In what ways do you think JSUD engage with combating anti-Semitism at both a wider communal or societal level, but also within perhaps a university setting as a Jewish student organization?
Yes. So on a society level, JSUD combats anti-Semitism by, for example, last year, before COVID-19, we visited a lot of politicians of the German parliament and talked to them about different issues, especially issues that the young Jews in Germany want to talk about. And of course, there is that point of anti-Semitism, definitely. And we also try to build allies with other organizations, or also on the political level, to advocate higher security measures for our events and stuff we have. And one thing on the social base is that we try to not making it only our issue, an issue of Jews, but also a more general social concern, that it shouldn't be only our mission to combat or to fight anti-Semitism, but also to make it relevant for the whole German society. And that's what we try also with our messages. And in view of the community level, it's that we try doing workshops and seminars. Of course, anti-Semitism is always a topic, and it's important for us to let people share their experience, ask for what is missing or what they think is missing in the fight against it, and then discuss on how we can handle and solve those problems. And one important thing about university work we do, or how we try to fight it on campus, is actually that we have a project that started last year and was supposed to be carried on this year. It didn't work out, so we passed it on to next year. It's called the Jewish Campus Week, and it is 1 week at specific campuses through Germany, that the Jewish students on that campus arrange a Jewish week on how to present the normal Jewish life. And we kind of want to show the non-Jewish society, or the non-Jewish students, we are like everyone else, and you can come to us and talk to us about Jewish life in Germany. And we try but our intention on that project is that we want to rather have the spotlight on the positive Jewish narratives, and to present what is amazing with us as a religion, as a culture, and what we do, and by that also bring it more into the general society. And we hope it should have a more educational task. So it's we want to prevent anti-Semitism as a form, preventing anti-Semitism should is our major form of combating it. So we think it's the most effective way. And that's why we try to educate the non-Jew students on our campus. Yes.
Absolutely. And it's, I totally agree with you. I think positivity is certainly the way to combat it. As Marina was even saying earlier, your stereotypical Jewish male in a kippah is not the only image of a Jew that we have.
Exactly.
Jews should be, in terms of education, should not just be learnt about in the history books. They should be learned about in all forms of education, whether that's art or politics, whatever. So I totally agree with you on that. Thank you for saying so. And coming back to it through the segue of positive Jewish identity and coming back to the topic of solidarity and coalition building. Clearly some of the, as you've said, the motivating forces behind the work of JSUD are this solidarity and positive outlook. Would you be able to speak to some upcoming initiatives that you might have that JSUD has in place that would be motivated by these ideals?
Yeah, one example for that is the current campaign we have with EUJS together, like with the European Union of Jewish Students. It's the campaign called Never Again Right Now. And they focus on the human rights violation of the Uyghurs in China. And we try to reflect it from like a more Jewish perspective. And the goal is like to draw more attention on that violation. And this is also like, we also want to show like the solidarity and like having attention on that, and also criticizing, for example, European or even German companies that take a direct part in the violation of the Uyghurs, because they ship their work onto China, and the Uyghurs go like to also like kind of concentration camps and work there, and they work for those European and German companies. So yeah, we try to put some attention on that issue with this campaign, which is also like very, very important for us. And also like, of course, like due to the current situation, a lot of projects we can only they can only take place next year. So it's also meeting other organizations, and also like some other political young organizations to like build those allies in the end to like fight together against anti-Semitism, and of course like right-wing extremism as well.
Absolutely, thank you. Thanks for that. And it is very such a worthwhile campaign that you're doing, the Never Again Right Now campaign. We've seen developments recently at a governmental level in the US and across Europe. So yeah, I'm sure we'll be watching that campaign closely. Thank you, Noah. I think that's us towards the end of the discussion. A huge thank you to yourself, Noah, and also to the rest of our speakers and panelists, to Laura, to Günther, to Ran, and to Marina as well, and to my colleague and co-moderator, Alina. The Halle attack represents an all too real reminder, I think, on the threat of far-right extremism in Europe. And I really do think such events, such as this, are vital, not simply in a reflexive capacity, but also in a forward-thinking nature, to learn lessons from such tragedies, and to show, as you mentioned, Noah, communal solidarity with one another, such as the campaign you mentioned. In our other commemorative events tomorrow, alongside the European Jewish Congress and the permanent representative of the Federal Republic of Germany to the EU, we'll be taking part in an official commemoration of the one-year anniversary of the Halle synagogue attack, where representatives of the German permanent representation, as well as from EJC and from ourselves at B'nai B'rith International, will be speaking. So be sure to keep an eye on our Facebook page for a stream of the event. And yeah, all that's left for me to say is another big thank you to everyone watching, and to our panelists and speakers today. On behalf of B'nai B'rith International, thank you to everyone for tuning in, and we hope to see you again soon.